and a very big welcome to all of our attendees this morning. We want to say thank you very much for joining these Tuesday morning Toolbox Talks. Coming up today is hazardous substances. We're going to be discussing fuel, whether it's diesel or petrol that you are using on site, and why we say that it falls into a hazardous substance and what you need to do. We're also looking forward to next week's public holiday. I'm sure many of you are looking forward to taking a bit of a break. And then we move back onto hazardous environments, where we're going to discuss sewers, a little bit of confined space entry that we are going to be discussing there as well. And then finally, at the end of the month, we're going to be looking at housekeeping of vehicles. And in that, we are going to be discussing the sanitization or the disinfection of vehicles, specifically because of COVID-19 protocols and what you can do or perhaps use in order to ensure that your vehicles are always kept clean and disinfected. Now, we know last week we discussed quite a bit about COVID-19. We had a very overwhelming amount of emails. We want to say thank you very much to all of you who did send through those questions. We managed to get back to most of you. There were a couple of questions that we are just obviously making sure that we have the right information. So we are doing our research to ensure that we give you that right information. So you can expect to have some answers this coming week. And then I did get an email last night about some registers and checklists. Now I see it was a duplicate email. When I sent it back again, I did see that I got a notification back from the mailbox stating that there was not sufficient space in order to send that email. So I'd like to request on behalf of every single person that has sent an email that has not received an answer yet, please don't feel like you're bugging us or maybe sending duplicate emails. We really don't mind. If you haven't received an answer as yet, or there are documents that you have requested and you have not yet received them, please don't feel bad. Just send them again. Just reply to that same email, forward us the exact same email that you sent before requesting what you need, and we will ensure that you get what you require. So we're sorry if that is happening. We did mention, though, just before this talk to Jacques, that we are going to be getting a list of all of you joining in so that we can send out the bulk email just requesting either that you use the Dropbox account that we have, otherwise you can give us an alternate email, perhaps that we can send some more documentation through for you. Well, let's get into it this morning. What are hazardous chemical substances? So this morning we are talking specifically about those liquids when it comes to fuel, diesel or petrol. But the definition is any toxic, harmful, corrosive irritant or asphyxiant substance or a mixture of such substances for which A, an occupational exposure limit is prescribed, and B, which creates a hazard to health. Now you will agree that both diesel and petrol fall into one of these categories. They are harmful. They are corrosive to a certain point, but they are also a mixture of substances that could create, for one, a flammable environment, specifically when it comes to your petrol side. We know diesel is very different to petrol in that way, but it is still flammable. It still creates that explosive nature, making it a hazard to health. So yes, if you are carrying around with you some diesel or fuel at any given time for projects that you are working on, perhaps for use inside some of your equipment, or perhaps even for your trucks, cherry pickers, or things like that that you're going to be using on site, it does fall under the category of hazardous chemical substances. However, we do want to mention, though, that some of the requirements for hazardous chemical substances will then not be applicable to you because you are not using as much. So in other words, you don't keep a 250,000 liter tank on your premises. You're probably running around with a jerry can of about 20 to 30 liters that you are needing for the day. In this case, there are certain requirements that you must still abide by because you are carrying a hazardous chemical substance, but you might not need to get an AIA out in order to do air monitoring or controlling, things like that. So as we go through the questions or answer through for hazardous chemical substances, particularly speaking about petrol and diesel, we are speaking to you plumbers out there that are really only carrying around a couple of liters at a time. So you're not having a whole storehouse, you don't have huge generators at your property, and if you do, well, then there's additional requirements. But what we want to focus on today is just those who are going out with their buckies and keeping about 20-25 liters of fuel with them in their vehicles in order to use in and around site. So when we discuss how fuel can get into the body and why it is so dangerous, there are a few areas which we want to ensure that we protect. Now this, again, it does come from the PPE side, so we are doing it back to front today. We don't want to start with PPE as your main form of protection, and that comes back to your control measures, your hierarchy of control. And we'll discuss that as well, where we want to try and eliminate the risk and the hazard before we resort to PPE. But because we need to understand how fuel or diesel and petrol can get into the body, it's very easy then to understand what types of PPE you should be using. For one, it can be breathed in or respiratory tract through the mouth and nose. So there you would want to protect the mouth and nose. How can you do that? Well, it's by having adequate nose and mouth protection, such as a respirator or even a general mask that will filter out a lot of the fumes. Then on skin, if you touch the skin through absorption, now many of you know that both diesel and petrol dry out your hands quite a bit. Petrol more than diesel, because diesel does contain a little bit of oil in it. However, petrol and diesel both will dry out the skin quite a bit, and a lot of that can be absorbed into the skin. Now, we also know that if it lays on the skin or gets absorbed into the skin, your hands become potentially flammable. And we've seen this also with some types of hand sanitizers, where if you are a smoker, it's very dangerous if you are dealing with this type of substance, because if it is sitting on your hands or perhaps on the cuffs of your shirts, or even in the cuffs of your jerseys and jackets that you are wearing for winter, this can become potentially flammable. So we just want you to be careful, obviously not creating huge fires, but it can create quite a nasty injury to your hands and arms. Now, the third and final way to get fuel into the body is obviously drinking it. So through the mouth once again, but this is going through now to the gastrointestinal tract. What we want to suggest here, and this is again, it seems like we shouldn't have to mention it, but on the bottles that we have, on our jerry cans, on those 25-liter drums that we're carrying around with us in our cars, have we made some sort of sticker on there? For one, there should be the highly flammable sticker, and we know this because diesel or petrol, that is always flammable, and so the jerry cans that we use should actually have that sign on it to say highly flammable. And you can get this from your general hardware store. If you can't find it anywhere and you're battling to get hold of it, or you've ordered one and you're still waiting for it to come through, just print one out in the meantime. We know it's not regulatory, but as long as you're doing something to show that what is in that jerry can is highly flammable. But go further than that and actually put in these precautions. Do not breathe it in. Do not allow contact with skin. Do not drink. And as I mentioned, you think we shouldn't have to say these types of things, but it is best if you have all of the bases covered. So rather ensure that on that jerry can, you're going to print it out once and put a little laminating pad or some DC fix around that printout, just to have all of these precautions in place. And you only have to do it once to a jerry can. Perhaps it's going to get destroyed after a few months. Well, then it's another one piece of paper that you have to put on every few months. So really, you might think again, why do I have to do this? Well, it is a hazardous chemical substance, and you need to identify it as such. So if you'd like to have a small little write-up about what you should put on it, drop me a mail. We can send you a little pamphlet, in fact, a little picture that you can then just print out yourself and stick onto your jerry can. So we want to then discuss this with you as the employer, and we will chat to you employees as well. But as an employer, the hazardous chemical substance regulations says that you should do certain things. Now, as we mentioned earlier, you're not going to be doing all of them if you're only carrying around just a few liters, but the increase in risk, and also determined by your risk assessment, you may need to go for the full package when it comes to hazardous chemical substances. So again, we're not painting everyone with the same brush. We are just saying if you are only using, let's say, 25 liters in the back of your bakkie, you need to ensure that your employee is adequately and comprehensively informed and trained. So that goes without saying. You need to ensure that your employee who is going to be using, handling, carrying, pouring, or doing anything with that hazardous chemical substance is adequately informed and trained. Now, what does this mean? Well, we need to have written instructions. The first document that you must have is your MSDS, your Material Safety Data Sheet. That will give you the precautions, it will give you the risks and the hazards, and it will tell you what you can and cannot do with that substance. With that, you need to design a standard safe operating procedure, the SSOP. Now, a standard safe operating procedure basically explains to the employee how to handle and store that hazardous chemical substance. And because it's a standard one, it should be in line with general regulations as well, which means you need to understand how handling of chemicals is done with the manufacturer. Oftentimes, the manufacturer has already designed a standard safe operating procedure for you. Then you will go as far as even doing a safe working procedure. Now, this is in conjunction with your risk assessment. This is how you in the company, and again, we're saying we're not painting everyone with the same brush. You might use your jerry can in a different way that we use it, perhaps for a different application. And that's where your safe work procedure comes in. It's more task specific. In other words, we're not just going to say using diesel or petrol and we pour it into something. We are going to specify what the safe work procedure is for using it inside a piece of equipment, such as a cherry picker or a scissors lift, how to use it in conjunction with a generator, how to use it in conjunction with a weed eater, petrol lawnmower, whatever it is that you are using for that specific task. So let's just get back to those three documents that you need. It's an MSDS for the specific type of chemical, a standard safe operating procedure, which, as we mentioned, oftentimes you can get directly from the manufacturer, and then your own company specific safe work procedure. All right, then the third thing that you are going to do, which comes to another document that must be put in place, is identify the potential risks and precautions. Now, again, you cannot go and download a risk assessment and then just use that in your company. It needs to be specific to the task. So when we're talking about potential risks, we are talking about the potential risk of getting or purchasing the actual fuel. Then we are talking about the risk of transporting that from one place to the next, decanting it either from a bigger source into a smaller source. For instance, if you've got a tank that you're keeping at the workplace, which will have its own health and safety regulations attached to it, and then into a jerry can, and then also the decanting from the jerry can to the piece of equipment that you are going to be using as well. And then included in that is the specific task that you're going to be performing with that chemical, because it could become explosive, flammable, toxic environment as well, depending on the spill. And these can have all different types of consequences that we need to ensure the precautions are adequate as well as effective in mitigating that risk. Now, how often must you perform a risk assessment of this nature? Well, you will perform a risk assessment of potential exposure every 2 years for the company. Now, this risk assessment is not the same as an issue-based risk assessment for the tasks. So let me just quickly explain the difference. A company that uses or keeps, handles, or stores any hazardous chemical substance must have a risk assessment for that substance based on all the activities within the company. In other words, that's the purchasing of it, the handling of it, and the storing of it wherever it is going to be inside the company, even if it is in the back of a bucky. That risk assessment is done every 2 years. But when you go to site and you're performing a task, you have a separate risk assessment for that task, but it must include the chemical that you are using. And in this case, it will be the use of petrol or diesel. And so that risk assessment, generally, it's a task or issue-based risk assessment that needs to be reviewed every 3 to 6 months, depending on your risk rating. So for that, if you need to know, send us your risk assessment, give us a bit of a background of what you're going to be doing, and we will give you the recommendation on how often that risk assessment needs to be reviewed. Now, the two final parts, and again, I said in the beginning, you might not be affected by this, that is your air monitoring by an approved inspection authority, as well as medical surveillance by a medical practitioner. Because you are having such a small amount, your risk assessment may not recommend an air monitoring or surveillance, medical surveillance to be done for specific hazardous chemical substances because your exposure levels are so low. But when it comes to a greater amount or a greater exposure level, in other words, you working with diesel and petrol fumes, 5-6 hours out of the day, well, then your hazardous chemical substance regulation states that you may have to have your air monitoring and medical surveillance. Again, if you need to know whether you have to have it or not, just drop us a mail, tell us what your specific tasks are, what type of hazardous chemical substance you are using, and what your exposure level is, and we will then send you the requirements according to hazardous chemical substance regulations. Now, again, this medical surveillance is not the same as medicals in order to work on site. So we just want to differentiate that. A normal medical, such as the one that you get with an Annex 3 on it to prove that you are fit to work, is different from medical surveillance. Medical surveillance, as it's talking about here in the hazardous chemical substance regulations, is saying that because you are exposed to this hazardous chemical, we need to periodically take a look at your health from a proper medical practitioner and see if it's slowly getting worse because of your exposure to that chemical. So it's a specific medical surveillance that is done by a medical practitioner and may not always need to be carried out in your instance. But you still need to have a normal work medical, and that is fitness to work. That is separate from this medical surveillance. So we hope you got that clear. If you have any questions, please drop us a mail and we will definitely try and assist you with that. So now we come to the actual risk part of hazardous chemical substances. And here we want you to follow the 5 hierarchy protocols. You need to follow this hierarchy of controls in order of preference. In other words, don't start with number 5. We need to start with number 1. The first one is to eliminate the hazardous chemical. Is it possible not to work with diesel or petrol? Well, in that case, you're going to say, no, I have to use it because if I didn't have the petrol or the diesel, the machine wouldn't work. Well, you've answered that question. You've tried to eliminate it. You could not eliminate it. The other way to eliminate it is to substitute it with a less hazardous chemical or even substitute it with a different method. Now you might think to yourself, well, how is that possible? Well, there is different possibilities. If your cherry picker or machinery runs out of fuel, is it possible for you to take it to the source of the fuel, let them fill it up and bring it back? If that is not practical because you are having to fill it up so often, well, then we move to an engineering control. Is there a method where you can take the human element out of refilling this type of hazardous chemical substance. Again, you're going to say, well, that's not possible. We don't have any type of engineering controls. We have to have that human element in place. Now, with a human element comes big risk. So the first thing you need to do before PPE is put administrative controls in place. And we've discussed what that is: training and documents. So you train that employee on how to use, handle, and store that chemical. You give them the MSDS. You provide the standard safe operating procedure. You issue a safe working procedure, as well as a risk assessment. And you need to put that in place because, as you can see, your risk level goes from green, which is pretty good, all the way down to eventually getting to that orange, which is a bit of a warning saying PPE is the last form of defense against those risks. So if you cannot do one of the first three, and in this case, I'm going to probably put myself out on a limb and say many of you cannot do 1 to 3 of the hierarchy of controls. You can only put in place 4 and 5. Well, then you can see what risk category you're sitting in. It's always going to be a risk, which means you have to have all of your administrative controls in place, as well as the correct PPE that is needed for that specific hazardous chemical substance. Now, this goes across the board. Although we're talking about diesel and petrol today, it can be used with any other hazardous chemical substance that we are using. Now, what about you as the employee, the person actually using that chemical? Well, the hazardous chemical substance regulation states that you must apply the training that you have received. If you forget something, request more training. Follow the written instructions of those standard safe operating procedures. Don't just sign it once off in a safety file and put that safety file in the office and then continue working. Read through it, understand it, know what the dangers are and how to prevent yourself from being injured. And then as an employee, you might not be the health and safety officer, you might not be the owner of the company, but you can help to identify potential risks and precautions. Because you are working with it every day, perhaps you found an easier way to avoid risk. Bring that to the attention of your employer as well as the health and safety officer. Perhaps they can put this in the risk assessment for you. Always read and understand the material safety data sheet that should be provided. Handle that substance in the correct manner to prevent exposure, and in this case it will be spillage of both diesel and petrol, and then use it in the correct manner. So handle it and use it in the right way. What we want to achieve here is preventing exposure, and if we can prevent exposure, we then prevent or minimize those risks. So maybe you're sitting there now saying, well, where do I get this information? Well, as an employer and an employee, you can get the right information for the type, use, and handling, as well as the prevention of that chemical substance that you are using, in particular, diesel and petrol. You can download the hazardous chemical substance MSDS, as well as regulations from the websites. You can request information from experts, such as your safety officers, perhaps even the actual manufacturer as well, and research that hazardous chemical substance online. Take a look at it. Type in petrol 95 unleaded and risk at the end of it, and you can then do research online to find out what are the dangers and how can you go about preventing it. So please remember, we want to put signs as well as precautions and labels on our actual jerry cans that we are constantly using, and ensure we have the right paperwork to keep ourselves as well as our employees safe. This will go further by keeping anyone who may be affected by our work safe as well. So thank you very much. Once again, a huge thank you to IOPSA, the Institute of Plumbing South Africa. A very big thank you to SIOSH for crediting this with 1 CPD point, as well as the PRB for 0.25 CPD points from their side. And then once again, a very big thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. So we look forward to chatting with you during the week. We are going to be missing next week as it is a public holiday, but then we look forward to seeing or speaking to all of you again on the 23rd. So if you have any questions, queries, emails, please drop us a mail and we will get back to you as soon as we can. My email address is on the top, chris@ohss.co.za. We're going to hand over